The Diary of Anne Frank. Review and anticipate. In Act 1, Anne Frank's father visits the attic where his family and 4 others hid from the Nazis during World War II. As he holds Anne's diary, the off-stage voice of Anne draws him into the past as the families begin their new life hiding from the Nazis. As months drag on, fear and lack of privacy in the attic rooms contributes to increasing tension between the family members. Act 1 ends on the first night of Hanukkah. The group's celebration is interrupted by the sounds of a thief below, who may have heard them. Read Act 2 to learn whether the hiding place has been discovered. Act 2, Scene 1. In the darkness we hear Anne's voice, again reading from the diary. Saturday, the 1st of January, 1944. Another new year has begun, and we find ourselves still in our hiding place. We have been here now for 1 year, 5 months, and 25 days. It seems that our life is at a standstill. The curtain rises on the scene. It is late afternoon. Everyone is bundled up against the cold. In the main room, Mrs. Frank is taking down the laundry, which is hung across the back. Mr. Frank sits in the chair down left, reading. Margot is lying on the couch with a blanket over her and the many-colored knitted scarf around her throat. Anne is seated at the center table, writing in her diary. Peter, Mr. and Mrs. Von Don, and Dussel are all in their own rooms, reading or lying down. As the lights dim on, Anne's voice continues without a break. We are all a little thinner. The Von Dons' discussions are as violent as ever. Mother still does not understand me, but then I don't understand her either. There is one great change, however, a change in myself. I read somewhere that girls of my age don't feel quite certain of themselves, that they become quiet within and begin to think of the miracle that is taking place in their bodies. I think that what is happening to me is so wonderful, not only what can be seen, but what is taking place inside. Each time it has happened, I have a feeling that I have a sweet secret. We hear the chimes and then a hymn being played on the carillon outside. The buzzer of the door below suddenly sounds. Everyone is startled. Mr. Frank tiptoes cautiously to the top of the steps and listens. Again the buzzer sounds, and Miep's V for victory signal. It's Miep! He goes quickly down the steps to unbolt the door. Mrs. Frank calls upstairs to the Von Dons and then to Peter. Wake up, everyone! Miep is here! Anne quickly puts her diary away. Margot sits up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. Mr. Dussel sits on the edge of his bed, listening, disgruntled. Miep comes up the steps, followed by Mr. Kraler. They bring flowers, books, newspapers, etc. Anne rushes to Miep, throwing her arms affectionately around her. Miep and Mr. Kraler, what a delightful surprise! We came to bring you New Year's greetings. You shouldn't. You should have at least one day to yourselves. She goes quickly to the stove and brings down teacups and tea for all of them. Don't say that. It's so wonderful to see them. I can smell the wind and the cold on your clothes. There you are. How are you, Margot? Feeling any better? I'm all right. We filled her full of every kind of pill so she won't cough and make a noise. She runs into her room to put the flowers in water. Mr. and Mrs. Von Don come from upstairs. Outside there's the sound of a band playing. Well, hello, Miep, Mr. Kraler. Giving a bouquet of flowers to Mrs. Von Don. With my hope for peace in the new year. Miep, have you seen Mouchie? Have you seen him anywhere around? I'm sorry, Peter. I asked everyone in the neighborhood had they seen a gray cat, but they said no. Mrs. Frank gives Miep a cup of tea. Mr. Frank comes up the steps, carrying a small cake on a plate. Look what Miep's brought for us! A cake! A cake? He pinches Miep's cheeks gaily and hurries up to the cupboard. I'll get some plates. Dussel, in his room, hastily puts a coat on and starts out to join the others. Thank you, Miepia. You shouldn't have done it. You must have used all of your sugar ration for weeks. Give it to Mrs. Von Don. It's beautiful, isn't it? It's been ages since I even saw a cake, not since you brought us one last year, without looking at the cake to Miep. Remember? Don't you remember you gave us one on New Year's Day, just this time last year? I'll never forget it because you had peace in 1943 on it. She looks at the cake and reads, Peace in 1944. Well, it has to come sometime, you know, as Dussel comes from his room. Hello, Mr. Dussel. How are you? Here's the knife, Li-Fi. Now, how many of us are there? None for me, thank you. Oh, please, you must. I couldn't. Good, that leaves 1, 2, 3, 7 of us. 8. It's the same number as it always is. I left Margot out. I take it for granted Margot won't eat any. Why wouldn't she? I think it won't harm her. All right. I just didn't want her to start coughing again, that's all. And please, Mrs. Frank should cut the cake. It's not Mrs. Frank's cake, is it, Meep? It's for all of us. Mrs. Frank divides things better. What are you trying to say? Don't I always give everybody exactly the same? Don't I? Forget it, Curly. No, I want an answer, don't I? Yes. Everybody gets exactly the same, except Mr. Von Don always gets a little bit more. Von Don advances on Dussel, the knife still in his hand. That's a lie! Dussel retreats before the onslaught of the Von Dons. Please. You see what a little sugar cake does to us? It goes right to our heads. Here you are, Mrs. Frank. Thank you. Then to Meep as she goes to the table to cut the cake. Are you sure you won't have some? No, really, I have to go in a minute. The sound of the band fades out in the distance. Maybe Moushy went back to our house. They say that cats... Do you ever get over there? I mean, do you suppose you could? I'll try, Peter. The first minute I get, I'll try. But I'm afraid, with him gone a week... Make up your mind already. Someone has had a nice big dinner from that cat. Peter's furious, inarticulate. He starts toward Dussel as if to hit him. Mr. Frank stops him. Mrs. Frank speaks quickly to ease the situation. This is delicious, Meep. Delicious! Dirk's in luck to get a girl who can bake like this. I have to run. Dirk's taking me to a party tonight. How heavenly. Remember now what everyone is wearing and what you have to eat and everything, so you can tell us tomorrow. I'll give you a full report. Goodbye, everyone. Just a minute. There's something I'd like you to do for me. He hurries off up the stairs to his room. Putty, where are you going? She rushes up the stairs after him, calling hysterically. What do you want? Putty, what are you going to do? What's wrong? Father says he's going to sell her fur coat. She's crazy about that old fur coat. Is it possible? Is it possible that anyone is so silly as to worry about a fur coat in times like this? It's none of your darn business. And if you say one more thing, I'll take you and I mean it. There's a piercing scream from Mrs. Von Don above. She grabs at the fur coat as Mr. Von Don is starting downstairs with it. No! Don't you dare take that! You hear? It's mine! Downstairs, Peter turns away, embarrassed, miserable. My father gave me that! You didn't give it to me! You had no right! Let go of it! You hear? Mr. Von Don pulls the coat from her hands and hurries downstairs. Mrs. Von Don sinks to the floor, sobbing. As Mr. Von Don comes into the main room, the others look away, embarrassed for him. Just a little discussion over the advisability of selling this coat. As I've often reminded Mrs. Von Don, it's very selfish of her to keep it when people outside are in such desperate need of clothing. He gives the coat to Meep. So if you will, please, to sell it for us. It should fetch a good price. And by the way, will you get me cigarettes? I don't care what kind they are. Get all you can. It's terribly difficult to get them, Mr. Von Don, but I'll try. Goodbye. She goes. Mr. Frank follows her down the steps to bolt the door after her. Mrs. Frank gives Mr. Kraler a cup of tea. Are you sure you won't have some cake, Mr. Kraler? I'd better not. You're still feeling badly? What does your doctor say? I haven't been to him. Now, Mr. Kraler. Oh, I tried, but you can't get near a doctor these days. They're so busy. After weeks, I finally managed to get one on the telephone. I told him I'd like an appointment. I wasn't feeling very well. You know what he answers? Over the telephone. Stick out your tongue. They laugh. He turns to Mr. Frank as Mr. Frank comes back. I have some contracts here. I wonder if you'd look over them with me? Of course. If we could go downstairs. Mr. Frank starts ahead. Mr. Kraler speaks to the others. Will you forgive us? I won't keep him but a minute. He starts to follow Mr. Frank down the steps. What's happened? Something's happened, hasn't it, Mr. Kraler? Mr. Kraler stops and comes back, trying to reassure Margot with a pretense of casualness. No, really, I want your father's advice. Something's gone wrong, I know it. If it's something that concerns us here, it's better that we all hear it. But the children? What they'd imagine would be worse than any reality. As Mr. Kraler speaks, they all listen with intense apprehension. Mrs. Von Don comes down the stairs and sits on the bottom step. It's a man in the storeroom. I don't know whether or not you remember him. Carl, about 50, heavy-set, nearsighted. He came with us just before you left. He was from Utrecht. That's the man. A couple of weeks ago, when I was in the storeroom, he closed the door and asked me, "How's Mr. Frank? What do you hear from Mr. Frank?" I told him I only knew there was a rumor that you were in Switzerland. He said he'd heard that rumor too, but he thought I might know something more. I didn't pay any attention to it, but then a thing happened yesterday. He'd brought some invoices to the office for me to sign. As I was going through them, I looked up. He was standing, staring at the bookcase, your bookcase. He said he thought he remembered a door there. Wasn't there a door there that used to go up to the loft? Then he told me he wanted more money, 20 guilders more a week. Blackmail! 20 guilders? Very modest blackmail. That's just the beginning. You know what I think? He was the thief who was down here that night. That's how he knows we're here. How was it left? What did you tell him? I said I had to think about it. What shall I do? Pay him the money? Take a chance on firing him? Or what? I don't know. Don't fire him. Pay him what he asks. Keep him here where you can have your eye on him. Is it so much that he's asking? What are they paying nowadays? He could get it in a war plant, but this isn't a war plant, mind you. I don't know if he really knows, or if he doesn't know. Offer him half, then we'll soon find out if it's blackmail or not. And if it is, we've got to pay it, haven't we? Anything he asks, we've got to pay. Let's decide that when the time comes. This may be all my imagination. You get to a point these days where you suspect everyone and everything, again and again, on some simple look or word. I found myself. The telephone rings in the office below. There's the telephone! What does that mean? The telephone ringing on a holiday. That's my wife. I told her I had to go over some papers in my office, to call me there when she got out of church. He starts out. I'll offer him half then. Goodbye. We'll hope for the best. The group calls their goodbyes half-heartedly. Mr. Frank follows Mr. Kraler to bolt the door below. During the following scene, Mr. Frank comes back up and stands listening, disturbed. You can thank your son for this, smashing the light. I tell you, it's just a question of time now. He goes to the window at the back and stands looking out. Sometimes I wish the end would come, whatever it is. Margot! Anne goes to Margot, sitting beside her on the couch with her arms around her. Then at least we'd know where we were. You should be ashamed of yourself, talking that way. Think how lucky we are. Think of the thousands dying in the war every day. Think of the people in concentration camps. What's the good of that? What's the good of thinking of misery when you're already miserable? That's stupid. Anne! As Anne goes on raging at her mother, Mrs. Frank tries to break in an effort to quiet her. We're young, Margot and Peter and I. You grown-ups have had your chance. But look at us. If we begin thinking of all the horror in the world, we're lost. We're trying to hold on to some kind of ideals, when everything, ideals, hopes, everything are being destroyed. It isn't our fault that the world is in such a mess. We weren't around when all this started, so don't try to take it out on us. She rushes off to her room, slamming the door after her. She picks up a brush from the chest and hurls it to the floor. Then she sits on the settee, trying to control her anger. She talks as if we started the war. Did we start the war? He spots Anne's cake. As he starts to take it, Peter anticipates him. She left her cake. He starts for Anne's room with the cake. There is silence in the main room. Mrs. Von Don goes up to her room, followed by Von Don. Dussel stays looking out the window. Mr. Frank brings Mrs. Frank her cake. She eats it slowly, without relish. Mr. Frank takes his cake to Margot and sits quietly on the sofa beside her. Peter stands in the doorway of Anne's darkened room, looking at her, then makes a little movement to let her know he is there. Anne sits up quickly, trying to hide the signs of her tears. Peter holds out the cake to her. "You left this." "Thanks." Peter starts to go out, then comes back. "I thought you were fine just now. You know just how to talk to them. You know just how to say it. I'm no good. I never can think, especially when I'm mad. That Dussel, when he said that about Moushy, someone eating him, all I could think is, I wanted to hit him. I wanted to give him such that's what I used to do when there was an argument at school. That's the way but here, and an old man like that, it wouldn't be so good. You're making a big mistake about me. I do it all wrong. I say too much. I go too far. I hurt people's feelings." Dussel leaves the window, going to his room. "I think you're just fine. What I want to say, if it wasn't for you around here, I don't know what I mean." Peter's interrupted by Dussel's turning on the light. Dussel stands in the doorway, startled to see Peter. Peter advances toward him forbiddingly. Dussel backs out of the room. Peter closes the door on him. "Do you mean it, Peter? Do you really mean it?" "I said it, didn't I?" "Thank you, Peter." In the main room, Mr. and Mrs. Frank collect the dishes and take them to the sink, washing them. Margot lies down again on the couch. Dussel, lost, wanders into Peter's room and takes up a book, starting to read. Peter looking at the photographs on the wall. "You've got quite a collection. Wouldn't you like some in your room? I could give you some. Heaven knows you spend enough time in there, doing heaven knows what." "It's easier. A fight starts, or an argument, I duck in there." "You're lucky, having a room to go to. His lordship is always here. I hardly ever get a minute alone. When they start in on me, I can't duck away. I have to stand there and take it." "You gave some of it back just now." "I get so mad. They form their opinions about everything, but we're still trying to find out. We have problems here that no other people our age have ever had, and just as you think you've solved them, something comes along and bang, you have to start all over again." "At least you've got someone that you can talk to." "Not really. Mother, I never discuss anything serious with her. She doesn't understand. Father's all right. We can talk about everything. Everything but one thing. Mother. He simply won't talk about her. I don't think you can be really intimate with anyone if he holds something back, do you?" "I think your father's fine." "Oh, he is, Peter, he is. He's the only one who's ever given me the feeling that I have any sense. But anyway, nothing can take the place of school and play and friends of your own age, or near your age, can it?" "I suppose you miss your friends and all." "It isn't just—" She breaks off, staring up at him for a second. "Isn't it funny, you and I? Here we've been seeing each other every minute for almost a year and a half, and this is the first time we've ever really talked. It helps a lot to have someone to talk to, don't you think? It helps you to let off steam." "Well, any time you want to let off steam, you can come into my room." "I can get up an awful lot of steam. You'll have to be careful how you say that." "It's all right with me." "Do you mean it?" "I said it, didn't I?" He goes out. Anne stands in her doorway looking after him. As Peter gets to his door, he stands for a minute looking back at her. Then he goes into his room. Dussel rises as he comes in and quickly passes him, going out. He starts across for his room. Anne sees him coming and pulls her door shut. Dussel turns back towards Peter's room. Peter pulls his door shut. Dussel stands there, bewildered, forlorn. The scene slowly dims out. The curtain falls on the scene. Anne's voice comes over in the darkness, faintly at first and then with growing strength. "We've had bad news. The people from whom Meep got our ration books have been arrested, so we have had to cut down on our food. Our stomachs are so empty that they rumble and make strange noises, all in different keys. Mr. Von Don's is deep and low, like a bass fiddle. Mine is high, whistling like a flute. As we all sit around waiting for supper, it's like an orchestra tuning up. It only needs Toscanini to raise his baton, and we'd be off in the ride of the Valkyries. Monday, the 6th of March, 1944. Mr. Crayler is in the hospital. It seems he has ulcers. Pim says we are his ulcers. Miep has to run the business, and us too. The Americans have landed on the southern tip of Italy. Father looks for a quick finish to the war. Mr. Dussel is waiting every day for the warehouse man to demand more money. Have I been skipping too much from one subject to another? I can't help it. I feel that spring is coming. I feel it in my whole body and soul. I feel utterly confused. I am longing, so longing, for everything, for friends, for someone to talk to, someone who understands, someone young, who feels as I do. As these last lines are being said, the curtain rises on the scene. The lights dim on. Anne's voice fades out. Scene 2. It is evening, after supper. From outside we hear the sound of children playing. The grown-ups, with the exception of Mr. Von Don, are all in the main room. Mrs. Frank is doing some mending. Mrs. Von Don is reading a fashion magazine. Mr. Frank is going over business accounts. Dussel, in his dentist's jacket, is pacing up and down, impatient to get into his bedroom. Mr. Von Don is upstairs working on a piece of embroidery in an embroidery frame. In his room, Peter is sitting before the mirror, smoothing his hair. As the scene goes on, he puts on his tie, brushes his coat, and puts it on, preparing himself meticulously for a visit from Anne. On his wall are now hung some of Anne's motion picture stars. In her room, Anne, too, is getting dressed. She stands before the mirror in her slip, trying various ways of dressing her hair. Margot is seated on the sofa, hemming a skirt for Anne to wear. In the main room, Dussel can stand it no longer. He comes over, rapping sharply on the door of his and Anne's bedroom. "No, no, Mr. Dussel, I am not dressed yet." Dussel walks away, furious, sitting down and burying his head in his hands. Anne turns to Margot. "How is that? How does that look?" "Fine." "You didn't even look." "Of course I did. It's fine." "Margot, tell me, am I terribly ugly?" "Oh, stop fishing." "No, no, tell me." "Of course you're not. You've got nice eyes, and a lot of animation, and a little vague, aren't you?" She reaches over and takes the brassiere out of Margot's sewing basket. She holds it up to herself, studying the effect in the mirror. Outside, Mrs. Frank, feeling sorry for Dussel, comes over, knocking at the girl's door. "May I come in?" "Come in, Mother." "Mr. Dussel's impatient to get in here." "Heavens! He takes the room for himself the entire day." "Anne, dear, you're not going in again tonight to see Peter." "That is my intention." "But you've already spent a great deal of time in there today." "I was in there exactly twice, once to get the dictionary, and then 3/4 of an hour before supper." "Aren't you afraid you're disturbing him?" "Mother, I have some intuition." "Then may I ask you this much, Anne? Please don't shut the door when you go in." "You sound like Mrs. Von Don." She throws the brassiere back in Margot's sewing basket and picks up her blouse, putting it on. "No, no, I don't mean to suggest anything wrong. I only wish that you wouldn't expose yourself to criticism, that you wouldn't give Mrs. Von Don the opportunity to be unpleasant." "Mrs. Von Don doesn't need an opportunity to be unpleasant." "Everyone's on the edge, worried about Mr. Crayler. This is one more thing." "I'm sorry, Mother. I'm going to Peter's room. I'm not going to let Petronella Von Don spoil our friendship." Mrs. Frank hesitates for a second, then goes out, closing the door after her. She gets a pack of playing cards and sits at the center table playing solitaire. In Anne's room, Margot hands the finished skirt to Anne. As Anne is putting it on, Margot takes off her high-heeled shoes and stuffs paper on the toes so that Anne can wear them. "Why don't you two talk in the main room? It'd save a lot of trouble. It's hard on Mother, having to listen to those remarks from Mrs. Von Don and not say a word." "Why doesn't she say a word? I think it's ridiculous to take it and take it." "You don't understand Mother at all, do you? She can't talk back. She's not like you. It's just not in her nature to fight back." "Anyway, the only one I worry about is you. I feel awfully guilty about you." She sits on the stool near Margot, putting on Margot's high-heeled shoes. "What about?" "I mean, every time I go into Peter's room, I have a feeling I may be hurting you." Margot shakes her head. "I know if it were me, I'd be wild. I'd be desperately jealous if it were me." "Well, I'm not." "You don't feel badly? Really? Truly? You're not jealous?" "Of course I'm jealous." Jealous that you've got something to get up in the morning for, but jealous of you and Peter? No. Anne goes back to the mirror. Maybe there's nothing to be jealous of. Maybe he doesn't really like me. Maybe I'm just taking the place of his cat. She picks up a pair of short white gloves, putting them on. Wouldn't you like to come in with us? I have a book. The sound of the children playing outside fades out. In the main room, Dussel can stand it no longer. He jumps up, going to the bedroom door, and knocking sharply. Will you please let me in my room? Just a minute, dear Mr. Dussel. She picks up her mother's pink stole and adjusts it elegantly over her shoulders, then gives a last look in the mirror. Well, here I go, to run the gauntlet. She starts out, followed by Margot. Dussel, as she appears, sarcastic. Thank you so much. Dussel goes into his room. Anne goes toward Peter's room, passing Mrs. Von Don and her parents at the center table. My God, look at her. Anne pays no attention. She knocks at Peter's door. I don't know what good it is to have a son. I never see him. He wouldn't care if I killed myself. Peter opens the door and stands aside for Anne to come in. Just a minute, Anne. She goes to them at the door. I'd like to say a few words to my son. Do you mind? Peter and Anne stand waiting. Peter, I don't want you staying up till all hours tonight. You've got to have your sleep. You're a growing boy. You hear? Anne won't stay late. She's going to bed promptly at 9, aren't you, Anne? Yes, Mother, to Mrs. Von Don. May we go now? Are you asking me? I didn't know I had anything to say about it. Listen for the chimes, Anne dear. The two young people go off into Peter's room, shutting the door after them. In my day, it was the boys who called on the girls, not the girls on the boys. You know how young people like to feel that they have secrets. Peter's room is the only place where they can talk. Talk? That's not what they called it when I was young. Mrs. Von Don goes off to the bathroom. Margot settles down to read her book. Mr. Frank puts his papers away and brings a chess game to the center table. He and Mrs. Frank start to play. In Peter's room, Anne speaks to Peter, indignant, humiliated. Aren't they awful? Aren't they impossible? Treating us as if we were still in the nursery. She sits on the cot. Peter gets a bottle of pop and 2 glasses. Don't let it bother you. It doesn't bother me. I suppose you can't really blame them. They think back to what they were like at our age. They don't realize how much more advanced we are. When you think what wonderful discussions we've had. Oh, I forgot. I was going to bring you some more pictures. Oh, these are fine, thanks. Don't you want some more? Meep just brought me some new ones. Maybe later. He gives her a glass of pop and, taking some for himself, sits down facing her. I remember when I got that. I won it. I bet Yopi that I could eat 5 ice cream cones. We'd all been playing ping pong. We used to have heavenly times. We'd finish up with ice cream at the Delphi, or the Oasis, where Jews were allowed. There'd always be a lot of boys. We'd laugh and joke. I'd like to go back to it for a few days or a week, but after that, I know I'd be bored to death. I think more seriously about life now. I want to be a journalist, or something. I love to write. What do you want to do? I thought I might go off someplace. Work on a farm or something. Some job that doesn't take much brains. You shouldn't talk that way. You've got the most awful inferiority complex. I know I'm not smart. That isn't true. You're much better than I am in dozens of things. Arithmetic and algebra and... Well, you are a million times better than I am in algebra. You like Margot, don't you? Right from the start you liked her. Liked her much better than me. Oh, I don't know. In the main room, Mrs. Von Don comes from the bathroom and goes over to the sink, polishing a coffee pot. It's all right. Everyone feels that way. Margot's so good. She's sweet and bright and beautiful, and I'm not. I wouldn't say that. Oh, no, I'm not. I know that. I know quite well that I'm not a beauty. I never have been and never shall be. I don't agree at all. I think you're pretty. That's not true. And another thing, you've changed. From at first, I mean. I have? I used to think you were awful noisy. And what do you think now, Peter? How have I changed? Well, you're quieter. In his room, Dussel takes his pajamas and toilet articles and goes into the bathroom to change. I'm glad you don't just hate me. I never said that. I bet when you get out of here, you'll never think of me again. That's crazy. When you get back with all your friends, you're going to say, now what did I ever see in that Mrs. Quack Quack? I haven't got friends. Oh, Peter, of course you have. Everyone has friends. Not me. I don't want any. I get along all right without them. Does that mean you can get along without me? I think of myself as your friend. No, if they were all like you, it would be different. He takes the glasses and the bottle and puts them away. There's a second silence, and then Anne speaks, hesitantly, shyly. Peter, did you ever kiss a girl? Yes, once. That picture's crooked. Was she pretty? Huh? The girl that you kissed. I don't know. I was blindfolded. It was at a party, one of those kissing games. Oh, I don't suppose that really counts, does it? It didn't with me. I've been kissed twice. Once a man I'd never seen before kissed me on the cheek when he picked me up off the ice and I was crying. And the other was Mr. Coopers, a friend of Father's who kissed my hand. You wouldn't say those counted, would you? I wouldn't say so. I know almost for certain that Margot would never kiss anyone unless she was engaged to them. And I'm sure, too, that Mother never touched a man before Pym. But I don't know. Things are so different now. What do you think? Do you think a girl shouldn't kiss anyone except if she's engaged or something? It's so hard to try to think about what to do, when here we are with the whole world falling around our ears, and you think, well, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, and what do you think? I suppose it depends on the girl. Some girls, anything they do's wrong, but others, well, it wouldn't necessarily be wrong with them. The carillon starts to strike 9 o'clock. I've always thought that when two people... 9 o'clock, I have to go. That's right. Good night. There's a second pause, then Peter gets up and moves toward the door. You won't let them stop you coming. No. Sometimes I might bring my diary. There are so many things in it that I want to talk over with you. There's a lot about you. What kind of thing? I wouldn't want you to see some of it. I thought you were a nothing, just the way you thought about me. Did you change your mind, the way I changed my mind about you? Well, you'll see. For a second, Anne stands looking up at Peter, longing for him to kiss her. As he makes no move, she turns away. Then suddenly, Peter grabs her awkwardly in his arms, kissing her on the cheek. Anne walks out, dazed. She stands for a minute, her back to the people in the main room. As she regains her poise, she goes to her mother and father and Margot, silently kissing them. They murmur their good nights to her. As she is about to open her bedroom door, she catches sight of Mrs. Von Don. She goes quickly to her, taking her face in her hands and kissing her first on one cheek and then on the other. Then she hurries off into her room. Mrs. Von Don looks after her, and then looks over at Peter's room. Her suspicions are confirmed. Aha! The lights dim out. The curtain falls on the scene. In the darkness, Anne's voice comes faintly at first and then with growing strength. By this time, we all know each other so well that if anyone starts to tell a story, the rest can finish it for him. We're having to cut down still further on our meals. What makes it worse? The rats have been at work again. They've carried off some of our precious food. Even Mr. Dussel wishes now that Mouchy was here. Thursday, the 20th of April, 1944. Invasion fever is mounting every day. Miep tells us that people outside talk of nothing else. For myself, life has become much more pleasant. I often go to Peter's room after supper. Oh, don't think I'm in love, because I'm not. But it does make life more bearable to have someone with whom you can exchange views. No more tonight. P.S. I must be honest. I must confess that I actually live for the next meeting. Is there anything lovelier than to sit under the skylight and feel the sun on your cheeks and have a darling boy in your arms? I admit now that I'm glad the Von Dons had a son and not a daughter. I've outgrown another dress. That's the third. I'm having to wear Margot's clothes after all. I'm working hard on my French, and am now reading La Belle Nivernaise. As she is saying the last lines, the curtain rises on the scene. The lights dim on as Anne's voice fades out.